We're really grateful to have this panel up here because all of these people have been so deeply involved in the hemp industry. They have they've grown the crop, they've fought with the crop, they've dried the crop, they've innovated with the crop, they've done all of these things, and I had a real good chat with John Lupian here for a couple of hours with Riley and I and some other folks, and we appreciate your time taking that with us. So to start this out, I'm just going to introduce really quickly, Charlie Levine is the owner of Hemp Acres, and he has a little processing facility down by Waconia on his farm. Charlie, it's always a pleasure to work with you. John Strophus, I've been on the road with you a time or two, does a good job talking about hemp as a grower and also as a person who's involved in the industry and sales and distribution and so on and so forth. So hails from Hastings, Minnesota. Very good. And had a real opportunity this summer to work with the Keatsers a little bit, meet them and at their farm in Vernon Center. Just a wonderful farm that you have and a mighty fine looking CBD hemp crop you had there too. So look forward to hearing what Sarah has to say. And then John Lupian, who was the founder of Basscor, who's worked a lot with fibers. They're all here. Let's give them a hand. So with that, Charlie, we're going to start with you. What on earth have you been up to with this hemp crop, and what have you accomplished, and what are all the good stuff?
Well, thanks, Harold, for having me here. Yeah, so I guess we started in 2016, right when the pilot program started off, and my grandmother's farm in Waconia was just a hobby farm, kind of sitting there, and there were these great steel sheds. So I took one of the sheds and gutted it and made it into a food-safe processing facility, and have inundated it with cold pressing equipment, milling equipment for the grain, cleaning it, and then have included CBD, supercritical CO2 extraction, where this is some of our hemp that we grew this year, a high CBD variety, planted 12 acres, and dried it and did some modifications to a combine to break it down, and now we just started firing up the extractor and making CBD oil. So processing and growing and yeah, exploring all the opportunities with hemp.
Charlie just explained this little video where you're one of the few growers in the state that actually use the combine to process the crop.
Yeah, so it looks like the video quality is not coming through on this, but we basically reverse engineered a combine to keep all of the leafy material and spit out the whole stalk. It's opposite of what a combine is meant to do, where it's trying to get rid of all that leafy material, put grain in the hopper. But yeah, just did some little settings here and there on it, made a couple tweaks, and it worked really well and saved oodles of time and labor. So yeah, that's something that we're going to be working on and perfecting year to year.
Well, it's quite an innovation because it takes a little work to do it the other way. John, tell us a little bit about your experience in 2019 with your crop.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. Minnesota Hemp Farms, we started in 2016. I don't exactly know how many slides we're going to show here. I got a pretty big deck, but basically we have a small farming operation, and in 2016 we were allowed to plant hemp. We pivoted to that and created Minnesota Hemp Farms to focus on that, primarily from a grain focus. We've also done some experimentation with fiber. I've worked with John a little bit on several things and hope to work with him more on the fiber side. And then this year, for the first time, previous years we've been working in the CBD space and marketing CBD products. We have a brand in the supermarkets and so forth for food and CBD. But this year was our first year growing experience actually with the CBD varieties. And there's many challenges, as a lot of people are aware, in the CBD space. And I can thank Charlie actually for helping us out on getting clones to plant and seedlings to start this year, because seed is the number one problem in my view on the CBD side outside of general regulatory issues. So we've been doing a lot in hemp for several years. The food, to me, is a long play with fiber. A lot of people eat food. A lot of people use products that can be made from the fiber. CBD is fascinating. It's hot right now. It's very interesting and it's exciting. But I think people underestimate how quickly farmers can produce stuff. And it doesn't take a lot of acres to produce a tremendous amount of CBD. And really, what I look at as the number one problem is who is going to buy more hemp products. Then the processing will come, the growing follows that. That's a natural order of events. And that's what we're trying to do, 10 hours of the day, is call on companies to use hemp products and of all different types. So that's our primary interest.
Sarah, tell us a little bit about what's happened in Vernon Center.
Thanks, Harold. So we are first-year hemp growers, entered the industry actually as a CBD retailer in Mankato, being the first one to open there just based on how CBD had worked for our family and our daughter. Kind of have a little story behind our brand. So I was kind of the spark, I guess, on our farm to look at diversifying to bring hemp to our farm. We traditionally farm conventional corn and soybeans and dedicated 8 acres this year to hemp production. So a steep learning curve. When we first decided to grow hemp, we thought initially that we would start with 20 acres and go big or go home that first year, give it a try. And after attending different conventions and really putting the rubber to the road to understand what that really looked like logistically, and knowing the amount of work that's involved, some of the earliest nuggets that we picked up is you can plant and size your growing operation based on your ability to dry, your drying space, kind of working it backwards that way. We did a lot of manual labor on our farm this year. The way we planted, rows were about 6 feet apart. Plant distance about 42 inches. So we went with like a 2,000 population per acre. We were able to mechanize some of the in between the row cultivation, but we did a lot of hand hoeing on 8 acres this year. And we just wrapped up harvest this past weekend. We actually purchased a dryer to have on our farm, but the dryer actually was a bit of a blockchain for us. The weather was cooperating, it was beautiful, but the dryer capacity can only hold so much. So we'd find that we were kind of slowed down by that. Decided that we needed to shift gears, get our crop out of the field, and looked at alternatives as far as hanging, and got all of that in place and set up, and here we are. So excited to take the products, I guess, to bring them to my shelves at my retail location. And then, as far as the marketing piece, some of that is still unfolding. It's good to have your processor in place before you plant your crop and know where your outlets are going to be.
Sarah, can you talk a little bit about, you had a little bit of an insect issue there to begin with. Can you talk about what that was and how you took care of it?
Sure. So we did a little bit different than some farmers. We did direct seed to soil. My husband, through his work with the cooperative and ag technology, was able to build a custom seed to soil planter. That was a wonderful way for us to utilize the good soils that we have in southern Minnesota. But along with that, as the plant is emerging, it's very small, obviously, and we were walking our field very early on and noticed that some of the cotyledons were really being chewed down by a very small insect, like smaller than a period at the end of a sentence, basically. Ended up catching one of them on a piece of tape and had to reach out to the extension service to have somebody help us identify what we were dealing with, actually, and it ended up being a garden springtail. So not a very common occurrence. We still really don't have a clear etiology as to why that pest, arose. And then we actually worked with Margaret and some resources that we had out of Colorado, learned that neem oil is a good approach for dealing with some insects and pests for this particular plant, and that's the direction that we went. And it took care of it, thankfully, but we did lose probably, we estimate maybe 5 to 10% early on because it was a pretty, prolific little pest, so.
Well, you jumped on it right away, and good for you. It takes a sharp eye out there to keep up with what's going on. Before we get to John, though, with all three of you growers, weed control is an issue. And I'd like to hear your comments on what you might do differently or what worked for you in terms of weed control.
Sure, I'll start. So we're in transition to organic right now, so kind of taking the toughest approach to dealing with weeds. And we actually purchased a 1974, I think it's a 160 International, real small vegetable cultivator tractor. It's kind of offset, so you can see right underneath. And then we got this cultivator 3-point attachment. It's got these like spinning rotary tillers that are in the ground, and somebody literally sits on the back and goes like this in between the plants. So with that small tractor and that cultivator, we're pretty confident that next year we will not have any weeds, and just getting at them quick enough. So we it was definitely a challenge this year trying to control them, and it got to the point where we were just weed whipping because there was nothing we could do, and there's nothing you can spray on it either. So yeah.
John, you didn't have any weeds?
Not in my pictures. On the grain side or fiber side of the production, really it's a choice between dense planting, late planting, lots of weed, tillage and post-emergence control that way, and dense planting to limit the amount of competition from weeds initially on planting. Some of the organics moving back to row cropping, actually, and cultivating hemp early. Kind of a balance there between row spacing and if you're better off with dense planting or cultivation, different growing conditions would be different that way. On the CBD production side, we planted into an existing hayfield. We rototilled strips, and then we laid plastic mulch, and we planted plants into that plastic mulch, and then we mowed weekly. So that was really nice to do on a small amount of acres. Doing that at large scale, 100-acre fields of CBD, that's kind of a different story, I think. But it's interesting on the row or the population size per acre. You hear about this 2,000 pounds per acre, and I think it's a balance between how much weed control that you can have at certain stages with that, and how precious your acres are versus how you want to manage them. I think it's a real balance in that regard.
Sarah, you had a nice John Deere tractor out there. You were just living the dream. So tell us about that.
Definitely. Weed control is an issue, especially from a labor and time standpoint. We focused on growing for CBD flower this year, and thankfully, coming from a conventional corn and soybean, grower, we had very low weed suppression in the field that we chose. Not to say that we weren't out there plenty. Yes, we had the cultivator that we bought a small John Deere tractor to go in between the rows, but we have nice labor at home, and our 15-year-old son, who spent a lot of time this summer hoeing, and then it's my husband and I and my mother and father-in-law. And so between the 5 of us, many miles were put on walking up and down, getting in between the plants. You can get in between the rows. And then when you start getting a canopy, it's less of a concern. But definitely early on, we thought that they would bush out a little sooner than what they did, and we kept kind of just waiting for that canopy to develop so that we could back off on some of that labor. But for next year, we'll probably keep things pretty similar to how we did them this year as far as plant spacing. And we've heard a few horror stories with cover crops, some people that had some misfortune with them. So I think we'll maintain what we've done this year.
All right, we'll come back a little bit later, take some audience questions for the growers. But John, you're the fiber processing king. So tell us a little bit about how you do it and what the future looks like on fiber processing.
I don't know if the king is the right word, maybe serf, but it's definitely quite the endeavor. It's very capital intensive. My background is actually history, and I started out kind of as an activist, idealist, thought I was going to change the world, write a book, explain why hemp was illegal. Eventually learned that I was really learning about entrepreneurship and what farmers and innovators were doing back in the 30s and 40s with hemp as a fiber crop and how they were trying to bring it into the modern age. And so around 2005, 2006, I started to figure out a way that I could build my own decorticator based on prior art. Eventually built one in 2009. Had a company called Bass Lab, patented a decorticator, brought it all the way up to pilot state, exited the company, started over again with a new company called Basscore. Developed that all the way to a pilot line. At Basscore, some of the successes were taking the fiber all the way to a textile grade fabric at commercial scale with U.S. grown, U.S. processed hemp. Did that with some of John's hemp too. And also creating powders with the wood material for plastic composites with a company out in Fargo, North Dakota, C2 Renew. Also taking that wood and innovating further and developing what we would refer to as, or we referred to as liquid hemp, which was a dissolved material composed of the polymers, cellulose, lignin, and sugars. And we were working on kind of a new rayon type of filament with that material. Developed stuff like lost circulation material for oil drilling. It was really, what I do is kind of solving supply chain issues. So it's taken that material off the field. This slide talks about that, what we look for. It really is related to the density and not having stalks that branch out like what we see with CBD. You can go as low as 18, 15 pounds an acre and have a single stalk that works. But really 30 pounds and up is where you want to be. That would be kind of dual purpose. Fiber varieties, you go as high as 40 pounds, 50 pounds an acre. And the density really relates to the amount of fiber on the stalk. And then that translates into the pricing for the end material on that. But one thing I would say about this side of the business is that in a bale, your primary material is the wood. So if you ever get into processing, you got to have markets for that wood first and foremost, as opposed to the fiber. Making products with the fiber is very difficult because it takes a lot of processing. Pardon me. Decortication is just the step of separating the bast fiber from the wood. You still have multiple steps involved to get that material to a product. Whether it's something low end like animal bedding, you're still looking at a sizable investment in equipment to get that product to market because it's got to be dedusted, sized, and compression bagged. And as well as say we're talking about a textile grade fiber, that fiber's got to be decorticated and cleaned down to about 1%. Really needs to be opened because that's going to speed up the next step, which is wet processing, which requires chemistry and specialized equipment again. You have to dry that with special equipment and open it while you're drying it, and then you have to refine it to meet the specifications of the type of spinning system that you're going onto. So it's very, very complicated. There's been a lot of companies that have tried it over the years and have failed. there's just a lack of knowledge, a lack of expertise. European systems tend to be very aggressive and beat up the fiber, so they're not really viable for that. There's just a lot of stuff that needs to be learned and a lot of innovation that needs to take place, and that's kind of where I've been working to bring that together and to bridge the farms to the markets.
You want to just touch on this slide here a little bit?
Sure. This is kind of a system that I'm proposing. It talks about the different steps that are involved. So you're going to have bales, either large round or large squares. Those bales need to be broken open and fed into a decortication system. And I talk about a system because there's a lot of different pieces here. So you need a piece of equipment that can break the bales open, either an opener or a shredder or something. And there's some equipment out there that can be bought on the market right now that does that effectively. That material needs to be metered in. That would be the feeder into the decortication, and the decortication is where that separation occurs. That material leaves the decorticator, and then it's got to be cleaned and isolated. And the cleaners, you can use cotton ginning equipment or standard textile equipment, but you need to understand how that needs to be put together and what those pieces of equipment are. So typically it'd be 1 to 2 to 3 cleaners, followed by something that refines that fiber. The wood is coming out at all stages of this, so that's collected. I don't really favor animal bedding as a product because it has a very low margin, so I went and developed ways to powderize that material or micronize it into fine powders for plastics and other products. So that's kind of what's described here is that process. And so there's different ways of doing this. European systems can cost tens of millions of dollars to get just to 2 tons an hour. There's a system out of Canada that's about 1 ton an hour that costs 1.6 million called the Hemp train. There's no one in the United States, including my old company, that makes any of this equipment that's commercialized yet. So it's pretty limited. So we have a lot of work to do, but it can be done and it's possible to do it. I've gotten to the doorstep, but it's very capital intensive.
Is there someone in the audience that would like to ask a question of John on the fiber side?
We're going to have you use the microphone so we get it on our recording.
Thank you, appreciate it. My name is Kurt Johnson from the northern Minnesota area, licensed. In the fiber side, is there no market for the pulp equivalent? Because we've all seen what hemp can do on a per acre basis compared to pulpwood, for that matter.
So
in the dyeing paper industry, by the way.
okay, so yeah, there's 2 materials there, and when you're talking about pulping, typically there are systems available now for pulping the fiber, but the wood's typically not pulped. So like Harold had a slide earlier that was the old USDA 1916 study. They actually tried to make that paper and they had a lot of problems. It doesn't process very well, that wood, because of the nature of it for paper. It's possible, but none of the equipment for pulping is geared for that kind of wood. But the paper, yeah. Mm-hmm.
He asked BTU content.
Oh, BTU. There have been some studies. It's, I think 15, 16 is where I've seen it. I'd have to look at that. I don't really look too closely at the energy value.
Riley does have that number. Maybe he can give us that BTU number.
We've got-
We did a little work on that.
Harold, we've got 2 more. I've got one up here, and we'll come back down. Who was it? Here we go.
So I heard you say that the equipment doesn't really exist right now to build this stuff domestically. Does that mean it doesn't really make sense to grow hemp for fiber domestically, or are there other outlets?
Growing it as a dedicated fiber crop, unless you have a market already established and a way to get to that market, I certainly wouldn't advise it. There have been 1 or 2 grows. Sunstrand grew a lot for fiber this past year, but they're no longer functioning. And we did process some fiber hemp that was grown on tribal lands, Sisseton Wahpeton tribe. But yeah, it would be under contract. So like say when, for example, Hanes Brands wants to put 30% in socks or underwear blended with cotton. We are absolutely going to have to go out and contract for hemp under fiber, because it's going to have to be very uniform to meet the specifications to spin at that kind of level. But right now that does not exist. So, for me, what I was doing is I was sourcing dual purpose hemp primarily. So John grew a variety that was X59. It produced a great fiber. There's other varieties out there. I actually processed a crop that was grown primarily for CBD. It produces single stalk. That stalk is sellable. It still produces fiber. So just growing it specifically for fiber, you need to, every step along the supply chain needs to be mapped out. We need to know, where that fiber is going to go. You got to definitely have a market for the wood, because you're going to have a lot of wood, because you're going to have a much higher yield per acre tonnage. So that just means that much more wood. So the wood is a big headache. You got to find a market for that, for sure, before the fiber, I would say.
Yeah, John Andrews with Sustain Organic Fertilizer. I've got a question. I've run into some users that their CBD levels went over 0.3 and lost their crops. And
THC or THC?
THC. What
Yeah.
did I say? CBD.
CBD.
And there's two prongs to that. One, I think that can be abated with better management, and but I don't understand why, because it could be diluted. I don't understand why they don't have the ability to do that.
Do what?
To dilute, to bring it down.
Yeah, I mean, some of that has to do with the way that they're testing. I mean, they're taking the tops off where it's the most concentrated. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that particular issue, the THC content and the standard of 0.3%. I don't necessarily agree with it. Fiber, though, you're harvesting before you even flower, so that shouldn't be an issue. It's really when it goes further to seed. But right now, like I just said, there's not really an established market for fiber, and there's certainly no infrastructure for processing it. But that's an issue I think that needs to be dealt with legislatively and educationally.
The company in Canada that was processed, is that in Alberta?
You're referring to the hemp train?
Yes.
I believe they were acquired by Groff North America. They were called Canadian Greenfield Technologies initially, and I do believe they were in Alberta.
Well, I have a question for the growers again, because this always comes up. Tell us a little bit about the feminization on the crop, and whether you had issues with males and how you dealt with it, and how much time and all the rest of it you spent pulling males. Charlie?
Yeah, where I sourced my genetics from, we purchased 30,000 feminized seeds, and of that 30,000, we found, I think, 2 or 3 males. So it was a great time saver to have that feminized crop. And then as far as fertilization went, we saw it was weird, and we planted kind of on a slope, and towards the bottom of the field we saw some plants that were covered in seeds, and then ones at the top that had none on it at all. So definitely something to keep in mind too, with the amount of feral hemp that is growing around Minnesota. There's pollen everywhere, and it's pretty much impossible to not have seeds in your flowers. But I've also heard that even if you do get seeds, that the CBD content can still be high at the levels that they're targeted towards.
We bought our plants from Charlie, and he only gave us 1 male. So thank you,
One
Charlie.
male. All right, 4 then.
No, so, to be honest, that was the biggest concern, especially when we were trying to source seed, really. Our plan was to plant most of our CBD from direct seed, because that's how we want to farm it, not transplant it. And we ended up with basically 99% transplants. So we didn't have any issues with males. But I think this is a really good topic that needs to be researched a bit more. But based on who I've been talking to over the last 9 months of this growing season, I think I agree with Charlie. The seed is not necessarily the end of the world. It depends on when it's pollinated and when that happens and how much it's going to reduce the CBD production. But we have to keep in mind that as more growers grow, whether they're trying for feminized seed and they end up with rogue males, or whether you have a grain farmer right next door to you, which I hope no legislation's ever passed that prohibits that we don't get into opportunity growing areas and districting and all that nonsense. If you want to plant feminized, smokable flower and premium stuff, then you're probably going to be in a greenhouse. I think that's just the way it's going. And then I think that through technology and processing and cleaning and sorting, that's where you're going to have optimal efficiency, where you have seeded crop and you pull those seeds off and you still use the CBD content of the flower, and then hopefully the fiber byproduct as well.
We, again, doing seed to soil. The seed that we purchased was feminized seed. I believe, if memory serves, it was 98% feminized. So with 8 acres, 2,000 population per acre, 16,000 seeds. We did purchase an additional, I think, 500 seeds as kind of a buffer on germination. So that gave us a potential of 30 some odd males in our crop. We began walking already August 3rd, I think it was, which was very, very early in flowering. It was, you needed a magnifying glass to see the pistil. But we walked the field probably 6 times, checking every plant for males. I think altogether we did end up with 14, I believe. Some of our male plants actually, because this plant is such a wonderful plant, it's meant to sustain itself, I guess you could say. We did have some hermaphrodites that came just through stress. We had 3 very severe windstorms, lost significant amounts of our stand due to the windstorms, and I think some of that stress, caused some hermaphrodite production. So we caught some of the males a little later than what we would have liked, but as far as pollination or affecting our CBD content, it really did not create much of an issue.
Harold, we have a question off to your right.
Yeah, I'd say the biggest issue is white mold. A lot of farmers down south too who are growing for grain saw significant loss with white mold. So I think that's probably the biggest issue, but as well as long as there's well-drained soil, cannabis does really well in wet conditions.
Go ahead.
I think to some degree, even though a first-year grower, I think to some degree because we did have such high rainfall that the root system really was different, maybe more shallow, less of a deep tap root because it just didn't need to work that hard for the moisture, which I believe made our plants a little bit more susceptible to the wind damage that we did have, but they were pretty significant winds in excess of like 60 miles per hour. So, but even those plants, the stems were completely tipped over, some of them completely broken up the middle, but it's amazing. We did go through and stake some of the plants, reached out to Charlie, get his advice, what do we do? But honestly, we could have left them alone. Each individual piece of the stalk just kept putting on flower like nothing had happened. So.
Way at the back. I don't think it's turned on. The question for the recording is, with the drying process and the odor that's created through the drying process, has that ever become a problem for neighbors?
We don't really have neighbors.
Same, Harold's been to the farm, we're pretty secluded. We do have some neighbors up and down our gravel, but they just think what we're doing is pretty cool, so.
I mean, it stinks, but I don't know. It goes away pretty quick.
We're in a rural setting as well, but I can see how that would be a problem. You know, if there's dense population around that, or if you're doing a commercial facility, there will definitely be some, and there already is, some reported different large startups in rural areas, but with dense population around them complaining about odors. I haven't heard that in Minnesota, but in other states.
John, I want to ask you a question here as we kind of wrap up, but where do you think that the fiber side is going to be in 2 to 5 years?
That's a somewhat loaded question. We need a capital investment to make that happen. So there's definitely market demand. You know, companies, big companies from Walmart to Target to Hanes and the Gap, and smaller companies like Patagonia, they all want fiber. The problem is the infrastructure is not there, and it's a large task. There's very few people that understand it completely. In fact, I don't even know if there's anyone that you could really refer to as an expert, including myself. So 2 to 5 years, hopefully we have the infrastructures at least up and we could toll process it to get it to product. That's what I was doing at Basscor. But the interest is there, so ideally we do have something. 5 years, there's definitely market interest and it's doable. You know, the question is the investment going to be there, and is the investment going to be there to help build the markets for the wood, because you have to have markets for the wood in order to do the fiber. So just real quick, say you have 20% fiber recovered after your decortication process. If you're going to make that into a textile grade fiber, it's only going to be half of that you're going to get into that final product. So again, that reinforces why you have to have markets for that wood. You might get a great price point on that fiber, but you're going to have very little of it after you've done all the work.
All right. Just before we wrap up, how many growers are in the room? If you raise your hand. All right. Thank you. Dan, I think I'd like to thank the panel of Charlie, John, Sarah, and John for being out here today and telling us about your experiences. And just one final question. Are you going to grow CBD again next year?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
And John, you're going to continue with fiber?
Yes.
There you go. Thank you.
Thank you,
Harold.
panel.